Okay guys, this video is going to show how I've done the wheel bearings on my HZJ78 series troop carrier. Just disclaimer, I'm not a mechanic or anything. This is simply what I've learnt from other people, and this is informative just to show you what sort of tools you may need and give you a rough guide. We're going to start by jacking the car up and taking off the wheel. From here we're going to remove the two bolts to remove the caliper at the back and gently pry the caliper off the drum. Put the caliper down where it won't get knocked and there's no strain on the cord. Using a 14mm socket, remove the axle nuts. Keep the axle nuts somewhat on, as you will need these on to remove the cone washers. Using a drift, or I'm using a socket extension, we're going to shock the cone washers. You'll need to hit fairly hard to remove these cone washers. Alternate tightening up the two M8 bolts to remove the axle. You may need a screwdriver to gently pry away. From here we should be able to remove and slide out the axle. Make sure that your car is higher on this side so you don't lose too much diff oil. Once the axle is removed, you'll be able to see the lock washer which is behind. Using a hand impact driver, we can now remove the two screws which hold the lock washer in place. Utilise the rear axle bearing tool to remove the lock washer. This can be bought from Toyota or other four-wheel drive stores. Once the lock washer is removed, set it aside and the locking tab. You should now be able to remove the hub assembly. Be very careful to keep it all together and take note of which way the bearings are seated. With the hub out, we now need to remove the bearings. Using a drift or an appropriate tool, we now need to remove the bearings and the bearing races. Once both bearings and races are removed, we can now clean up the hub, utilising brake cleaner and rags. Ensure that the gasket is removed from the hub and the axle. From here, we can now begin packing the hub with wheel bearing grease. Ensure you use high temperature wheel bearing grease. I'm using Penrite. Once the hub is packed, we can move on to packing the bearings. Keep pushing grease through the bearings until it has come out the other side. Insert the new races. Be careful to push them down evenly. I'm using a race installation kit, which I found from Troopy Auto and made the job very easy. Make sure they don't go down on an angle at all, otherwise you may damage the race. The race will go down with the flat end facing downwards. With the races now in, we can now put in our bearings which have been packed, and after the bearings, the seal, the back end pokes out.
Flip the hub over. Little bearing. There.
When hammering the new seal in, make sure this goes down evenly as well so you do not damage it.
Yep.
I'm using the old race
actually
to make sure it goes down gently. Now we can remove the axle seal. You'll need to buy this as it's not part of the kit. and insert your new one.
Have you got the seal in the outside there?
Yep, the axle seal's there. Now we can work on assembling in the reverse order. With your hub back together, slide it back on and make sure the bearings are sitting in nicely. Place your locking tab back in the hub area and your lock washer and do up hand tight. From here we're going to use a torque wrench and our rear axle bearing tool again. We need to preset our torque wrench to 59 Newton meters, and this will be for seating the bearing. Do up the bearing tight and keep on spinning the hub as you do to remove any air bubbles and distribute the grease properly. Keep spinning the hub back and forward from here, distributing the grease, and I'm using a soft face hammer to replicate some off-road conditions. There are little grooves on the spline, and if done correctly, one of your 3 studs on the lock nut should line up with these. Insert your screws to hold it in place again. We can now insert the axle again, making sure we have the axle seal and also the axle felt in place. We can now insert the cone washers again and do up the axle studs. These should be done up to 60 Newton meters, but refer to your Toyota manual for the exact specs. Stop recording now. We can now put the brake drum back on and also reinstall our caliper. Place the wheel back on and do any final checks to check for any movement in your bearings.